Welcome to meeting number 49 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Before we go into, security is here. Are all the members comfortable to have the person here or, ask him to? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Today we will be commencing our study on the government's response to the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan. On behalf of all the committee members, I would like to welcome the Honorable Sean Fraser, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, and also the officials from IRCC. Today, along with Minister, we are joined by Kristen Fox, Deputy Minister. We are also joined by Jennifer McIntyre, Assistant Deputy Minister, Afghanistan, Catherine Scott, Assistant Deputy Minister, Settlement and Integration, Pammy Gill, Director General, International Network. We will begin with the opening remarks from the Minister. Minister, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's good to see you all again, colleagues. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to appear before committee, which I have joined you at before, not only at the Immigration Committee, but at the Special Committee for Afghanistan as well, to discuss some of the issues regarding the government's response in terms of the Refugee Resettlement Initiative, trying to provide a second lease on life to some of the world's most vulnerable people. Our effort in Afghanistan represents one of the most difficult and largest resettlement initiatives in Canadian history. We're doing what we can to help a number of different groups, people who've served alongside the Canadian Forces, worked with the Government of Canada during our mission in Afghanistan, reuniting families for people who've previously been resettled in Canada, and helping promote a pathway to Canada for people who are being targeted as a result of who they are or perhaps what they contributed to. The challenges associated with this resettlement initiative are unlike any other effort, certainly that I've been a part of, but I would suggest that has taken place in recent history in Canada or most other places in the world. The kinds of challenges that we're dealing with range from chaos that took place during the evacuation as the Taliban closed in on Kabul, the lack of international capacity when it comes to refugee resettlement as a result of a number of years where states around the world withdrew from refugee protection during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the lack of a Canadian presence on the ground after the withdrawal of the Canadian Forces, and over the course of the resettlement initiative, a lack of a diplomatic presence as well. Of course, certain continued challenges persist. In particular, the difficulty in securing safe passage for people who remain inside Afghanistan. I'd remind you that we're dealing with a territory that has been seized by the Taliban, a listed terrorist entity in Canadian law. It can be extraordinarily difficult in the shifting landscape of requirements for people who seek to move throughout and outside of Afghanistan, present challenges that are unique to this particular mission. Despite the intensity of these challenges, there's some successes that we're proud of, though the job is not done. To date, there's approximately 28,000 Afghans who've been successfully resettled in Canada, who have been given that second lease on life. I've had the opportunity to meet a number of them. I'll tell you, folks, it's a special experience when you get to join families on the tarmac when a plane arrives. I've watched parents kiss the ground as they've welcomed kids the same age as my kids into Canada because they finally come to believe that they're safe after horrific traumas that they've suffered. We're dealing with people who are being targeted because they were trying to build a better life for themselves, their families, and their community in Afghanistan, working as human rights defenders, journalists, because of who they are, members of the LGBTQ2+ community, religious minorities, and other groups. Women leaders, often, if I think of women judges who've been seeking to make their way to Canada, who are often responsible for actually putting members of the Taliban behind bars, who are now being persecuted and facing threats of torture or death as a result of their desire to contribute. I can tell you, folks, this is probably one of the proudest things I've ever been involved with. It's one of the most difficult things I've ever been involved with, but it's the kind of thing that, in my mind, makes the jobs that we sign up worth doing. The opportunity to use my life to make a difference in my own small way in this role, to protect the lives of others, is something that I relish the opportunity to contribute to. Je m'excuse si je parle en anglais.
I'm very sorry that I've spoken mostly in English, indeed in English. It's an issue difficult for many to understand, but it's really important to support those who are most vulnerable. We have nearly 28,000 people who have come here, who have secured safe passage.
Canadians are proud of, but challenges do remain. There are difficulties for people who are still in Afghanistan. There are difficulties for people who are in third countries that haven't been able to secure the necessary documents to exit those third countries from their current hosts. But whatever challenges remain, we're not going to waver in our commitment to resettle at least 40,000 Afghan refugees, a commitment that I'm proud of, but work that we will continue to move our way through until we complete this goal. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd be happy to take questions from members of the committee.
Thank you, Minister. We will now go to our round of questioning, and we will begin with Ms. Rempel-Garner for 6 minutes. Ms. Rempel-Garner, you can please begin.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, I'm aware of the magnitude of the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. As the wife of a U.S. veteran who served in Afghanistan, this issue cuts pretty close to home. My questions relate to Recommendation 3 of the report and the creation of an emergency mechanism to enable fast evacuations of person in a crisis zone. I'm trying to ascertain if one already formally existed but wasn't disclosed to Parliament. Evidence exists that a parliamentarian and others within the government felt that the government was so woefully unprepared to evacuate persons from Afghanistan that they resorted to issuing fraudulent documents and used a process by which political staff and a senator got to choose who got on evacuation planes. With nearly 1 million Afghans who expressed interest in being allowed to Canada, this undermined the fairness of Canada's immigration policies while putting Afghans like the family of my constituent at risk. My constituents were involved in this, as you know, and will be subject to some of my questions. Minister, on July 26, you wrote me a response to a letter I wrote on July 7th. The subject of the letter related to a family of Afghan nationals that my office was assisting that had allegedly been issued official documentation stating that they had been granted a visa to enter Canada. They received this documentation from Senator Mary Lou McPherson. In your response, you stated that these letters were inauthentic and that your department had undertaken a review of the matter. In your investigation, was it determined whether the minister, at the time, any IRCC departmental official, or any of the IRCC minister's office staff ever advised any third parties, including ministerial office staff or parliamentarians, to issue official travel documentation to Afghan nationals for the purposes of allowing them access to evacuation flights or to otherwise gain entry into Canada?
Thank you very much for the question. I appreciate it, and thank you for the letter that you sent me this past summer. The issue that you first, the preamble to your question touched on whether there was an emergency evacuation strategy that was available and not used in the instance. No, there was an effort made in that instance to move people as quickly as possible through the use of these facilitation letters. I do think it's worth exploring, perhaps in a separate question, what we should do going forward to build surge capacity to respond in emergencies. The facilitation letters that you're referring to were issued by the government at the time for people who were intended to come into the program.
I appreciate you giving background. I'm just wondering if your investigation into my letter ever determined whether any of your staff, the department officials, political staff, advised any third party, including parliamentarians and other political staff, to issue these facilitation letters?
No, the investigation internal to IRCC concluded that the letters it issued did not come officially from the Government of Canada, but there was no information I received as a result of that investigation along the lines you've suggested. Senator
McPherson asserted in the other place this week that she issued these visa facilitation letters in coordination with the former Chief of Staff to the Defence Minister, George Young, and a group of persons who included former Cabinet Minister Marianne Monsef. Did your investigation ascertain whether or not her allegation in the Senate was true?
No, but it's important that we understand that IRCC is very good at detecting the use of documents that are unofficial, but we don't have functionality built into this department to be investigating political staff and parliamentarians. That's why when we concluded that the letters at issue were not officially offered by the Government of Canada, we shared with law enforcement, not to make an allegation, by the way, against any particular individual, but to put the documents in the hands of someone who had the ability to investigate as they saw would be fit.
You mentioned that IRCC has the capacity to detect inauthentic documentation. My office was in coordination with your department as early as August 2021, showing them copies of this documentation. Why wasn't it detected that it was inauthentic until after I wrote you the letter in July of last year?
The cases that you rose with me regarding your constituents actually helped inform some of the process. The reality was we first became aware of a media report about this time last year, late January, I believe, that started asking some questions tied to a particular organization. That's when we started the investigation.
Thank you.
It took a number of months to reach the conclusion, but your outreach actually helped facilitate
Thank you.
the
As part of your
investigation.
investigation, and there's numerous media articles that have talked about how Senator McPhedran's letters helped facilitate people into the country. How many persons were gained access into Canada using Senator McPhedran's letters?
None that I am aware of, and I think it's really important that we understand that the facilitation letters were used only to allow people to clear Taliban checkpoints and to move throughout the Hamid Karzai International Airport. Even people who received legitimate letters from the Government of Canada still had to go through the ordinary application process to qualify for the program.
Ms.
I'm not aware of anyone who's accessed Canada on the basis of these letters.
The letter I'm in possession of states that the person who it was granted to says they've been granted a visa to enter Canada. Ms. Fox, has your department begun an investigation on how many persons were granted entry into Canada using inauthentic letters issued by a parliamentarian and anyone else that Senator McPhedran raised in the Senate last week?
Thank you for the question. I think what I would say is that these were not, the facilitation letters were just that, facilitation letters that had the word visa in it, but it was to get through checkpoints, and
So-
visas were issued to our clients.
Should I have been issuing fake visas to get my constituents into Canada? And do you believe that the people who have these letters now should be allowed access into Canada?
I think that it is really important as a department when we issue official Government of Canada letters that they are used officially, and therefore any time that we get a suggestion that there is an inauthentic letter in circulation, we have to conduct a review.
And Minister, you do realize the message this sends, right? All of us here have had constituents who are trying to flee war zones. They didn't have the luxury of getting these letters. With this family, I worked for a year to try and find out what was going on. Do you believe that the letters Senator McPhedran used, and we know that there are people who got into Canada through media reports using these letters, for those that are holding them and that are in Afghanistan, do you believe that they should be allowed access to Canada? And is this sending a message that parliamentarians were the system's so broken that we should be issuing fake visas to get people into the country?
Madam Chair, I see time has run out. I would be happy to respond, but should I wait to? I'll take.
Maybe you'll get an opportunity to respond in the next round.
Okay,
We'll come back to
Ms.
it.
Rumpelgarn, I'd be happy to respond should you have more time, because I think this is a very important issue to dig into.
We will now proceed to Mr. Dhaliwal. Mr. Dhaliwal, you will have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, first of all, I want to thank you and your Deputy Minister Fox and the other associates for appearing today. And one thing, Minister, the honourable members on the other side will agree that you are very accessible. Anytime we have asked you to come to the meeting, you have promptly responded and been here. I want to commend you and hope you will continue to do that. Minister, Afghanistan issue is very, very near and dear to me, other members who were on the Standing Committee on Afghanistan, and many of my constituents as well. And you mentioned that nearly 28,000 of the 40,000 expected Afghans have already arrived in Canada. Are you confident that we will reach our target of 40,000? If so, what more needs to be done to ensure that the target is met? And you also mentioned that this is one of the most difficult and largest effort that we are making. And if you had to identify or summarize, what are some of the key bottlenecks for remaining number of people to reach 40,000 person target?
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal, and I'm happy to make myself available. I think the work this committee does is extremely important. Yes, I'm confident we can achieve the goal of resettling at least 40,000 Afghans by the end of this calendar year. But there are challenges that keep me up at night. Securing safe passage for people who are still inside Afghanistan is extremely difficult. The shifting landscape that we experience on the ground poses challenges that would have been beyond my imagination before I had the privilege of sitting in this particular position. In particular, we're dealing with people who are being hunted. We are dealing with people who are being persecuted every day, who are being targeted by the Taliban on the basis of trying to have done good for their community or by virtue of their service with the Canadian forces or the Canadian government. The kinds of challenges that exist that are unique beyond this kind of persecution include changes at the border. After we had worked to secure a pathway for some of those destined to Canada to make their way towards Pakistan, for example, the Taliban responded by insisting on exit documents that prevented people from leaving. We have challenges for people who are in third countries who are unable to access the documents that they need to leave that we need to work with international partners for. There are some families that I've learned of who are inside Afghanistan where some family members have a passport but do not want to leave without other family members who have not yet secured those travel documents. And if you place yourself in the shoes of these families, of course, they have reservations about approaching the Taliban to access a passport, given the fact that it is their persecutor who has the authority to issue those passports. There are challenges at every turn. The biggest challenge that I see is securing safe passage for people who are deep into the approval process, but can't access a safe pathway to move throughout and outside of Afghanistan. Whatever the scale of the challenges, we're not giving up on these people. We're going to do everything we can to provide a pathway to Canada. It's a commitment we've made to them, and it's a commitment we intend to make good on.
Thank you. Minister, there are many groups and settlement agencies here in Canada, and there are some of them in my constituency of Surrey Newton as well, doing some great work when it comes to helping the most vulnerable that come to our lands here. Minister, what are you doing to ensure that Afghan refugees have the support that they need to succeed when they start their new lives in Canada?
First of all, let me take this opportunity to say thank you to the people engaged in settlement work across Canada. They are heroes who are dealing with people who are often experiencing severe mental health needs, who have been through traumatic experiences, and the level of support that they need is extraordinary in many instances. We work with settlement agencies to ensure that they have the financial resources that are necessary to provide the services that they are expert in providing. Of course, there's programs that provide things like income support, temporary accommodations for people as they become established in Canada. But this is going to be a long time for a lot of families to feel safe, to feel whole in their new communities. I find that some of the best supports come not only from government or settlement agencies, but from communities. Look at the role that private sponsorship has played in both the Syrian and now Afghan refugee resettlement initiatives. When we see Canadians coming together to provide support for our newest community members, it's extraordinary what personal benefits accrue to families who have that kind of wraparound supports. It can be challenging. I'll tell you that the capacity of some of the organizations we're dealing with is stretched pretty thin. Because they are doing so much heavy lifting, not only helping Afghans, but Syrians who continue to arrive, or more recently Ukrainians who've been granted access to settlement services. It's not easy, but by contributing financial resources to help settlement agencies, providing support directly to families, and continuing to assist Canadians who want to provide support for those that they sponsor to come here, we can set people up to have a good chance at success here in Canada.
You have mentioned Ukrainians, and there has been a lot of confusion among the public when it comes to the difference between the situation of people trying to leave Ukraine and those attempting to leave Afghanistan. Could you briefly explain some of the differences?
Sure. I think I've given you a sense of some of the challenges from a resettlement perspective and safe passage perspective that is unique to Afghanistan. The situation in Ukraine is also horrific for so many families who are facing a war of aggression, missiles being dropped in their neighborhoods. But for many Ukrainians who seek to flee, they had access to the western border. They could access transportation networks once they got into other European countries and within a day be in one of many countries where they are permitted to travel. Many of them had access to commercial flights they could access on their own. There are parts of the country where moving throughout Ukraine is extremely difficult. There's no question. But when you
Sorry
saw...
for interrupting, Minister. Time is up for
Okay.
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desaep. Mr. Brunel Desaep, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Minister, for being here. And thank you to the officials for being with us as well. Minister, perhaps you were expecting this question from me, but you know very well that the Canadian Criminal Code right now restricts humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. I put forward a motion on this, which was blocked by your colleague, Mr. Littier. Everyone knows that this has been a problem for a year. It's not been solved. Why isn't it solved? And what do you want to do to ensure that it is solved? Just before I respond, perhaps I have a problem with the volume of the interpretation, but I do understand the question. Shall I put the question again? Can we restart my time? Very well, I'll start again. I'm so sorry.
Merci, je comprends la question.
But I do understand the question. It's a very important question. And thank you to the committee for your recommendation on the matter of the criminal code.
Minister Sajjan has indicated previously, the government intends to advance a legislative solution to overcome some of these barriers, which I think will be important. I think it's important as well that we recognize the unanimous nature of the endorsement from this committee to include such a recommendation. And my hope is when we come forward with legislation to solve this issue, it maintains the support of all parties.
C'est la même réponse que j'ai.
It's the same answer that I've been hearing for a year now, Minister. We do have a problem with the bureaucracy here. The U.S. has changed its legislation, so have European countries. The UN has the 2615 resolution that it's been voting on already. And Canada, we always told we're going to change it. Do you think that the Minister of Justice is stronger and more important than yourself when it comes to actually helping people who are in need?
Important that we recognize that amongst ministers, we all represent the Government of Canada. We all work on behalf of the Government of Canada. When I advance a particular measure, that's a measure not of my own ministry exclusively, but a measure that's supported by the Cabinet and Government. We do need to move forward to clear whatever bottlenecks exist to provide humanitarian assistance and to potentially move people throughout Afghanistan as well.
Donc, tout le monde est d'accord.
So we all agree, but no one's doing anything about it. Wonderful. What a great way to turn us all into cynics. Minister, about managing the crisis in Afghanistan, we have seen that many regular files have been sort of put on hold because 25% of the staff at IRCC was working on the Afghan crisis. There were a number of things that they really had to deal with, given that people were in immediate danger. Their lives were at issue. But the question that I have is, the Bloc Québécois proposed to the government in June, and it's one of the recommendations in the report as well, to create a permanent emergency mechanism to manage international crises such as natural disasters or armed conflict. And could you tell the committee whether such an emergency team would be created to work in future?
I support notionally the idea of the creation of some surge capacity within the department. I think getting the details right is going to be very important. This issue is actually going to be one of the subjects that we address as part of a strategic policy review that's just getting underway that we hope to complete by May to understand how we can protect surge capacity if we're going to continue to respond in real time to migration crises. One of the things that I have come to understand in this position is that Canada, in fact, global refugee resettlement systems have been designed over many years to respond to protracted refugee crises, to resettle people who've often been displaced many years after they've been displaced. There has been a change in approach over the past number of years where we are trying to respond in real time to crises as they unfold, and I very much like the idea of building in permanent capacity to respond, and over the course of the next few months we're going to be consulting Canadians to understand how to design such a system in the right way.
Fantastique. Vous voyez comment le Bloc Québécois est un...
Wonderful. You can see that the Bloc Québécois is anxious to make useful proposals. Yes, thank you. It's a good idea. About the Afghans, again, after the committee tabled its report, there was an article in La Presse covering this issue. Some people waited so long in third countries, in Uzbekistan, for example, for their request to be treated by Ottawa, to be processed, that their visas expired, and they had to go back to Afghanistan, where they're being hunted down by their Taliban. So what do you intend to do with such seekers, such asylum seekers? Because their visas expire, because the department isn't handling them fast enough.
I see with the responding to these crises in real time is you're often reliant on third-party partners who have their own rules about visa policy.
Non. Je ne veux pas savoir qu'est-ce qui s'est passé, je veux savoir qu'est-ce que vous faites.
I don't know what did happen. I want to know what we're going to do. We're working very closely with our international partners. I understand the importance of the situation. We are working to work out the bottlenecks with our partners.
Pakistan, when we're dealing with people who are destined to Canada, we usually are able to find solutions that where we can receive assurances or solutions to make sure the people that we've made a commitment to that are our program will be able to come to Canada. It can be difficult in some instances, but we will not give up on a single person that we have made this commitment to.
Donc, vous rassurez ces gens-là qui ont eu des
You're reassuring these people who have expired visas that you are still doing everything possible to reactivate their visas so they can get here?
The arrangement we can reach with a third-party partner. In some instances, people never had a visa to begin with because as they fled, they crossed in an irregular way, but we still try to receive assurances from their host country that we will take them to Canada, and we expect and hope that they will be able to treat them with compassion and respect along the way.
2 semaines, Monsieur le ministre, vous nous dites
You were telling us recently, Minister, that there was no categorization for asylum seekers who benefit from Canadian programming, but interpreters, people who worked at the embassy, are a separate category for selection. I have a list of 65 Afghan judges who were not selected. When I hear that,
Get an opportunity in the
On s'en parlera dans
second
votre bureau.
round. Your
Merci.
time is up. We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Minister and officials for coming to the committee today. On the Afghan file, actually, first I'd like to touch on the issue around the cultural interpreters. They've been excluded from the program, and they required for legal counsel, actually, representing the families to take the matter to court. I think just before we started this meeting, I think one of the cultural advisors spoke with you about the lack of action from the government. So from that perspective, I guess, why is it that the cultural advisors excluded? Now, I know that there's work in place to try and include them, but still, they're family members, extended family members that are excluded, who are being targeted and hunted down by the Taliban because of their work for Canada. So will the minister confirm that those extended family members for the cultural advisors would be brought to safety?
Ms. Kwan, thank you for your advocacy, and obviously there's people facing very vulnerable circumstances. I want to be careful commenting on any specific cases, particularly when there may be legal proceedings involved. I don't want to breach any confidentiality or want to protect the integrity of any legal proceedings that may be at issue with this.
Yeah, maybe I can just interject here. I'm not asking about any specific cases, but a class of people. As you know, there's a class of people who are excluded, which actually took, taking legal action against the government. It shouldn't actually have to come to that. I hope the minister realizes that. Now that this issue is before us, the question here is, what's the minister going to do about it? And will you ensure that those family members are brought to safety, including their extended family members?
So just a couple of things. We made a decision on certain categories to bring extended family members here, and we've actually expanded the definition of family across many aspects of this program to recognize cultural differences that people who may not be a nuclear family still consider themselves as a family unit. We rely on referral partners to place people into our programs in most instances based on either their contribution to Department of National Defence or Global Affairs Canada, and we accept their referrals. But we also have people who can be referred into the program based on vulnerability through private sponsorship or government-assisted programs. And I see you want to take this in a different direction.
Well, actually, I want to get to the quick and to the answer and not this background to which I already have, because I only have 6 minutes and I don't have that much time to get to you on direct questions. So my question here is this. Going forward, will the minister take action to ensure that these family members come to safety? And in addition to that, you have a 40,000 limit. With that limit, the reality is this. That number has reached its maximum. And that means a lot of the family members have not been through the system in this processing, are not going to be able to get to safety. I have a spreadsheet upon spreadsheet of people who serve Canada and their family members who's been left behind and been ignored in hiding, being hunted down by the Taliban. And some of them are in Pakistan where their visa is expired and the police are knocking on their doors because of that expiry of their visa. So this is very real. So if you don't lift the 40,000 quota that the government has set arbitrarily in preventing Afghans to get to safety, you're handing them a death sentence. That's the reality. And the only reason why they're in danger is because they served Canada. So my question here is twofold. Will you help to bring those families to safety, change the policy if that's what's required, and lift the quota?
I want to be careful not to make guarantees to people whose files I may not be fully aware of, because people often hang on to every word that I say. I'm open to flexibly applying definitions of family, as we have for other programs throughout this process, to bring more people here. We've made a commitment to welcome at least 40,000 Afghan refugees, and I'm always looking for ways to continue to do more to help more vulnerable people get here. But the reality is the situation is that I know there are people who are vulnerable because of their work with Canada. We've created these programs to try to bring more of them here. I'm happy to work with you and others and members who want to speak to me, including the gentleman who spoke before this meeting began, to understand the situation and how we can improve policies to support more vulnerable people.
Minister, I appreciate that. You've offered that before. I've raised these questions before. I have submitted letters to you. I've written to you. I've sent the spreadsheets to you. I've brought them to your staff for attention. And you know what? They've all just sitting there saying there's nothing to move forward on. There's no progress. And nothing has moved. I have other situations where a family member of one brother being left behind, and supposedly they apply under the wrong stream, and so that was being corrected. But then since then, there's no progress. We don't know what's happened to that family. I don't even know if under the new stream, if they've been approved. You can understand the anxiety that the families feel. I feel their anxiety, and that's only 1/1000th percentage of how they feel. And that's the reality of what they're faced with. So I appreciate the offer, but the reality is that there's very little follow-up. So what do we do with that? And what we're waiting for and what I would like to see is a policy change and a public announcement. It shouldn't be just one-off who we're working with. I think that the situation that my colleague MP Michelle Rempel-Gardner had raised might be exactly the problem, where there's this situation where some people got preferential treatment. And I don't know how it is that some people got facilitation letters and others didn't, because I also had spreadsheets of people who needed to get to safety and never got one, and nobody told me that, hey, there are these facilitation letters that you can get. How do you get them?
Madam Chair, do I have time to offer a response?
20 seconds.
Okay. Look, there was a lot built into that question, obviously. If the question is how did people get facilitation letters, they were issued to people who were being brought into the program during the evacuation for a time-limited purpose. During the evacuation of Kabul, they were limited, the ones that were officially offered by the Government of Canada, to individuals who were supposed to be coming through part of our resettlement effort. I'd be happy to chat further if we have an opportunity for follow-up questions in a subsequent round.
Thank you, Minister. We will now proceed to Mr. Reddycobb. Mr. Reddycobb, you will have 5 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister and officials, for being here. I just want to pick up on that question about the Human Rights Tribunal case. And I know you can't comment on the case specifically, but reading in the Star about that, the individuals are alleging that you neglected your role as Minister of Immigration, that you're letting families swing in the wind, that you have also settled 2 of the cases, which implies that there is some agreement you have with that, and there's 2 more cases yet to go. But my question is actually, part of that I read that there will be, IRC will be publishing a new public policy related to the language culture advisors and their families. And so my question is, where is it, and when will it be made available?
Be published online very soon. I can't speak, obviously, to the details of the settlement. I think it's important before we publish anything that might have revealing personal information, we be very careful that we don't put people at risk.
So very soon is?
Look, I'll turn to our officials in case they have a better sense of the precise timing, but
I would say kind of within the next couple of weeks. We're just finalizing the details.
Okay. Can you forward that to the committee once it's published?
Yeah.
Thank you. Also, I want to now pick up on what Ms. Rempel-Gardner was speaking about. And I have a quick question here, Minister. Do you agree that it is illegal for anyone other than officials delegated with authority by you under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to act on your behalf?
I'm not here to project legal conclusions about what people may have done for what reasons. I can tell you that there were particular documents that were authorized from the Government of Canada. The letters to which Ms. Rempel-Garner referred to were not officially offered by the Government of Canada.
So if I was to issue a document that purports to be from the Government of Canada on this issue, you would say that was wrong, I shouldn't be doing that?
Look, the context, I think, depends greatly on what you're sending to whom and for what purpose. But I don't think it's advisable for me at this committee to start reaching legal conclusions about the illegality of a fictional example.
So you're aware, though, of these fraudulent visas that Senator McPhedran was sending to individuals. And so my question is, are you aware if IRCC had any instrument of delegation of authority to the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan, anyone employed by the Department of National Defence, or the Senator in question to issue these documents?
Sorry, Madam Chair, could I ask the member to repeat the question? I had an interruption just with the audio, and it was hard to hear with conflicting. No, it's not on you, Brad.
Please repeat.
Okay.
I've stopped the clock.
So are you aware if IRCC had any instrument or signed any instruments of delegation of authority to the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan, anyone employed by the Department of National Defence, or the Senator in question to issue any documents on your behalf?
So there was some authority given to the Canadian Armed Forces on the ground during the airlift. But to my knowledge, if you're asking about whether there were third parties who were authorized at a political level or amongst parliamentarians, no such authorization to issue facilitation letters was given by our IRCC. Okay.
Then regarding your exempt staff, and I'm thinking in particular of your former Chief of Staff, Olga Redchenko, and others, did they give written or verbal permission to anybody to bypass the minister's authority and authorize the issuance of these travel documents by the senator in question?
Not to my knowledge, and out of respect for people who have been responsible for saving as many lives around the world as any Canadian that I have met in the last number of years, I would ask us to be very careful about attributing malice without evidence to any political staff. But not to my knowledge, I don't believe that anyone in my office has given such direction or assurances.
I agree totally with you on that. I think it's a bit of a shame, though, that the policies of your department and the slowness of bringing Afghans to Canada caused somebody to do something that may have been, or that was outside of the norm. And I think that's what the concern is, because if the department had been working more efficiently, if these people had been coming, then maybe that situation wouldn't have had to arise. What do you think of that?
Look, I disagree with your characterization, respectfully, of course. The situation at the time, and of course I don't have personal experience because I came into this position shortly afterward, but it was apparent that it was a chaotic situation as the Taliban closed in on Kabul. There were many people who were trying to save as many lives as possible. Where I have some serious concerns is about the idea that someone may have been given the indication that they would be permitted to come to Canada without having the authorization to give such direction. It's very serious, because if you look at the potential for a few hundred people plus an average of 8 family members per person, the idea that those people should somehow displace others who have been referred into the program based on their vulnerability is something I think we need to take seriously.
Exactly.
But I don't want to make allegations about a particular person's behavior under what may have been circumstances that they were trying to save lives.
Do you think we owe anything? Do you think Canada owes anything to those people who received that documentation, who thought they were coming to Canada?
I think we need to have a full understanding of the expectation that was created by the Government of Canada in these instances, but I think it's really important that we don't substitute an official process that was designed to bring people based on their vulnerability that would allow some people, based on a relationship they may have, to access the program. We're dealing with all permanent residency programs that have a finite number of people, including refugee resettlement, and I think it's very important that we respect the integrity of the process.
Thank you, Minister. Time is up for Mr. Redekop. We will now proceed to Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, you will have 5 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin. Mute. You can figure out. We will proceed to Mr. Brunel Desaib for 2.5 minutes.
5 minutes?
2.5 minutes, and then we will come back. MPLE, we will come back to you. I'm proceeding to Mr. Brunel Dessep for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, il y a quand même des questions.
Well, some good questions have been put by Conservative members. Do you think it's normal that people should feel they must work around the rules because your department isn't able to ensure that they are able to get here quickly? If people jump through the necessary procedures to save their lives, well, it's not normal perhaps, but is it normal that people here would be breaking the laws of their own government to try to help save lives?
I want to be careful to say that I've not made a conclusion or assertion that people are out breaking laws. I think there is nothing normal about what happened in Kabul. There was a chaotic situation where the Taliban was closing in to overtake a city that had not been under the control. Thousands of people's lives were saved during that phase. About 3,800 or so from that initial evacuation are actually now living safely in Canada. I don't think anything about the effort of evacuating a city, as it's being overtaken by a listed terrorist entity could be described as normal. I think there were many people involved that were trying to do their best to help some of the world's most vulnerable people in that moment.
Donc, en gros, vous trouvez ça normal?
So overall, you think it's normal? Fine. As I was saying earlier, a couple of weeks ago, you told us that you don't work solely by categorization. Nevertheless, interpreters, for example, and others have been helped. And now I'm speaking of the 65 Afghan judges. I've sent to your department the list that I have, and I'll send it again. How can we say that we're selecting interpreters and people who worked at the embassy, but that there's no categorization? That's a paradox.
I appreciate the nature of your question, but if you'll indulge me, I can explain, I think. There are certain categories that we developed to target people based on either their contribution to Canada's effort in Afghanistan or based on features about them or their activities in life before the Taliban takeover that made them particularly vulnerable. When it came to people's contribution to Canada, we relied on referrals from the Department of National Defence and Global Affairs to identify the people that they wanted to refer into the program. We also created a program for an additional 5,000 extended family members of previously settled interpreters. The other categories that exist include members of the LGBTQ2 community, human rights defenders, journalists, and others who were vulnerable. Sorry, go ahead, monsieur.
Oui, mais il me reste 10 secondes. Vous avez un pouvoir.
I've got 10 seconds left. You have some discretionary power. In the past, your predecessors used that discretionary power handling Kosovo and Syria. Why haven't you done it for Afghanistan?
There are certain exceptional examples, and I note some that you and I have spoken about before, where we needed to use some elements of discretion. But I can tell you, developing the response to Afghanistan involved a great deal of discretion across the creation of new programs that did not exist. We have innovated to bring new referral partners to welcome certain vulnerable communities. We've created new programs that allow government departments to refer people into our refugee resettlement program in a discretionary way in order to respond to particular needs. Be happy to carry on the conversation offline.
We will. The IT is working with MPLE, so we will go to Ms. Kwan for 2.5 minutes.
Madam Chair, I believe I've just heard him.
Mr. Ali, can you?
Yes.
Is it okay?
Can you hear me?
So yes, you can please begin. You will have 5 minutes.
Through you, Madam Chair, thank you for being here today, Minister, to share the progress of your work on the Afghan file. Minister, over the past few months, I have had the opportunity to greet Afghan newcomer families arriving at Toronto Pearson Airport on charter flights from various locations. Could you share with us could you share with the committee the successes and challenges of providing support for the journeys of vulnerable Afghans from third countries and about the assistance provided by various organizations?
Thank you very much to my colleague, and I received a similar question from one of our other colleagues earlier in this conversation. I think I canvassed some of the challenges about moving people throughout Afghanistan. There's unique challenges for those who find themselves in third countries. The kinds of challenges people run into sometimes depend upon the circumstances under which they entered that third country. I think about people who may have traveled to Pakistan, for example, who had a valid visa versus people who crossed in an irregular way, both categories potentially who qualify for Canada's immigration programs. The uncertainty that some people have if they don't have a legal immigration status in a host country on their way to Canada creates extraordinary concern for them and their families. We have other unique challenges when it comes to working with international partners to secure the ability to allow safe passage from Afghanistan into those third countries. But on the second part of your question, I think some of the supports that organizations provide, there are so many heroes living amongst our communities. I think about Farah Bors in Calgary, who has been responsible to provide services welcoming thousands upon thousands of vulnerable Afghans. There are people who are dedicating their lives to the well-being of some of the people who are fleeing unimaginable circumstances. We work with them to help fund the settlement activities that they provide. We work with them to better understand the unique challenges that people are facing who are living in these communities now. But there was quite a few elements to your question, but there's no shortage of challenges. But the successes to me are apparent when I meet people in communities. But the real mark of success, I think, we'll observe half a generation from now when I'm long retired from politics and I see a generation of girls who get to go to school. That's when I'll be able to celebrate success.
Thank you, Minister. We know from the Special Committee on Afghanistan study and report that there are unique challenges to the Afghan resettlement effort, specifically regarding finding ways to help people exit Afghanistan. What has the government been doing to work with neighboring third countries to ensure safe passage out of Afghanistan?
Thank you. So the safe passage issue requires partnerships not just with states in the region. It obviously requires that as well. It also requires work on the ground inside the country with third parties who can help move people throughout the country. This is an enormous challenge. We do not have a military or diplomatic presence on the ground in Afghanistan, and moving people throughout the country remains the biggest obstacle to success. But we do have the ability to work with third parties. I hesitate to speak too openly about some of the current conversations that we're having for fear we may shine a light on some of the strategies we're pursuing that could jeopardize the potential for success of those strategies. But when we're looking to work with partners to facilitate not just the travel of vulnerable individuals to those countries, but for permission to stay long enough to complete whatever process may be remaining, to secure opportunities to have chartered flights that may bring people from a third country to Canada. All of this requires constant conversations with countries in the region through which safe passage could be possible. We have not put all of our eggs in any one basket. If there is a state partner we can work with on the international stage in the region, we have been taking calls with them, taking meetings with them, and work continuously in partnership to secure opportunities for vulnerable Afghans, not just to flee Afghanistan, but to be safe temporarily in a third country before their onward travel to Canada.
Thank you, Minister.
Mr. Ali, if you can move the mic a bit closer to your mouth, because the interpreters are saying it's like...
Is it okay? Is it okay?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Minister, can you tell us if there has been any progress made by your department on the recommendation of the Special Committee on Afghanistan with respect to allowing Afghans to use other pathways, such as study permits, economic mobility pathway pilots, and economic immigration streams, without assessing the intention of returning to their country of origin?
Thank you very much. This is an extraordinary opportunity, in my view, to do good for additional vulnerable people. In fact, last night I was meeting with a group involved in private sponsorship who is trying to help us scale up the EMPP program. What's unique about this program, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that it provides a pathway to permanent residency for people on the basis of their economic migration who happen to be displaced. There's more recommendations I want to dig in. I'm out of time, Shafkat, but including the potential to examine opportunities through the study permit system. But perhaps we'll get an opportunity to discuss that in greater length soon.
Thank you, Minister. We will now move to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 2.5 minutes. You can please proceed.
I'd like to just go back to the 40,000 cap. So it's clear that there are people who serve Canada and their family members who are at risk and in danger, and they are not part of the system at the moment because of the cap. Knowing that, will the minister lift the cap so that those applicants could get a chance to get to safety?
I don't have an announcement on a new target to make at today's committee hearing. To the extent that we can find complementary pathways that allow us to do more good, of course I'm interested. Anytime we're dealing with permanent residents who come to Canada, it's essential that we plan as part of our annual immigration levels plan or specific decisions that are taken through an official process of the government, so we can work with settlement agencies to work with capacity.
Thank you, Minister. Of course, the minister knew or should have known that there are these Afghans who served Canada and their family members who could not get to safety before this moment in time. The minister have known this for a long time now. I certainly have written enough letters to the minister to fill a cabinet drawer full with respect to that. And so this is not new to the minister, and that information was there before the minister prior to the immigration levels plan was released. So I bring this to the minister's attention because people's lives are at risk. Until that happens, these people will not get to safety, and that is the reality, and that the government of Canada is giving them a death sentence. That's also a reality that they will face. I'm sorry to say that, but that's how people are being treated on the ground. On the different question, I asked officials for information regarding biometrics, and I've got the information back to indicate that 3,486 unique applications representing a total of 10,568 persons have at least one person within the application waiting to have their biometrics completed as of December 23rd, 2022. That means they can't get their biometrics. Will the minister consider alternatives so that they can get to safety? Because they cannot get those biometrics. Can they not do that outside of country? And for some of them, actually in-house when they arrive in Canada.
Let me address your first point briefly and then answer your question directly. One of the things that's important when we're talking about the number that we're trying to resettle, we have received expressions of interest from more than 1 million people who want to come to Canada.
Sorry, Minister, it's not expressions of interest. I'm talking about very specifically of people who serve Canada and their family members.
I understand, but I think it's important that people understand the scale of interest in people who are seeking to take part in this program. On your question about biometrics specifically, we've actually implemented a different security screening process that starts with enhanced biographic screening that we allow to have people move through the process to complete biometrics in a third country. We are now seeing that biometrics and security screening is not the bottleneck that it was a year and a half ago in this mission. It's proven to be somewhat successful in my view. It ensures that we can have a rigorous security screening process pre-arrival, but it doesn't compromise the ability of a person to go through the process while they're still inside Afghanistan.
It remains 10,560 people are still stuck in the system.
And nearly that many are actually still in Afghanistan.
We will now proceed to Ms. Rempel Gardner for 5 minutes. Ms. Rempel Gardner.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at an article that was originally published in the Edmonton Journal in November 2021, and it's entitled Afghan Imposters Cutting in Line. It talks about how the special immigration measure that the government put in place to evacuate persons out of Afghanistan, particularly persons who had a relationship to the government of Canada, that there may have been many people who were on the evacuation flights who actually were not approved under this program. Has your department, Ms. Fox, done an audit of how many people were on these evacuation flights that had not been authorized through the special immigration measure?
Thank you for the question. Of course, as the minister has described, this was a pretty volatile environment. We can confirm that as we provided facilitation letters for our clients, the people that we had relationships with, we contacted them about the purpose of the letter, the objective of the safe passage, and their entry into obtaining a visa and getting on a flight.
That wasn't my question. My question was, have you audited the people who got on against the flight against the people that you asked to apply for the special immigration letter, and whether or not they had that authorization?
Yes, a full assessment occurred when they got here, and they were on flights with visas issued by the Government of Canada.
Okay, so in this article, it talks about how this is a woman named Lauren Oates, who is an NGO director who, credit to her, did a lot of work to get people out of Afghanistan. But she talks about a family of 14 people who were on an evacuation flight who were not authorized. Did you have any indication of something like this occurring?
I don't know the specifics of that case, but I think, as I indicated, we did do a full evaluation of who were on those flights, and they were clients through the SIM program.
Okay, so the same article says, with regard to, she doesn't name a particular senator, but she goes on to talk about how a senator was, and this is her quote that she gives, people, she, the senator, didn't know were writing her, just saying, you gave a letter to these people, can you give a letter to me? And she would just issue a letter to anyone who would ask. How many instances of letters issued by Senator McPhedran has your department come across?
Thank you for the question. I think that what we were able to determine is we know exactly how many letters the department issued, and this is why we did the internal review. We then referred the matter to law enforcement, who are looking at the next steps in this process. But given the fact that we did not issue the inauthentic letter, it would be impossible for me to determine exactly the numbers that are circulating. But we are aware of cases that are circulating.
Can you table a copy of the result of your internal review with the committee?
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you. Also, can you table a copy of what an authentic facilitation letter looked like during this with committee?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I'll cede the floor to Mr. Redekop.
Just for what it's worth, I think it would go with the obvious caveat of not revealing personal information of someone who has taken part in the process.
Of course.
On the issue of numbers, I have many people in my riding who are trying to sponsor people to come to Canada from Afghanistan. There's an organization called Nest. They've tried to sponsor 4 different families. Everybody's waiting longer than what's there. And Nest, for example, got a letter saying that they cannot, that the allocations are full. Yet we are not anywhere near 40,000, and you even today said at least 40,000. So I'm curious, are the allocations full? Why aren't we continuing to process people so that we can get to that 40,000 number?
Thank you. So I think what's important to understand is that even though there's a significant majority of people have now arrived, there's close to 28,000 of at least 40,000 that we will be seeking to bring to Canada. But of the remaining spaces, we can talk about 8,000 people who are deep into the approval process that are still in Afghanistan. We can look at some of the allocations that have been given to sponsorship agreement holders. So from the federal government's point of view, the spaces may be allocated to the organization that will be helping facilitate the travel of someone here, but it may not be the case that the organizations have allocated each of their spaces to every individual who may be coming. So it's a bit of a nuanced explanation, I appreciate, but it's important to understand that most of the spaces we know have been allocated to organizations that will help refer people into the program, even though not all of the people have arrived yet in Canada.
Back to investigation for a minute. You said that you didn't have the resources to investigate parliamentarians earlier. Do you have reason to believe that there should be some additional investigations done to parliamentarians or to others to look more widely for some of these false documents?
When this issue first came about, I wanted to make sure, and Madam Chair, can I take 20 seconds?
Yes,
wanted to make sure we dealt with this in a responsible way. The department conducted the internal investigation, which was the appropriate first step. When it ran its course and got to the end of what the department is capable of, sharing the information with law enforcement was an appropriate step so they can determine whether a further investigation is warranted, and if so, how it should look. I don't think it's appropriate for the government to necessarily be doing it in a way that is not independent and to provide documents to an organization that has that independent status, I think is important so they can determine the next appropriate steps.
Thank you, Minister. We will now proceed to Mr. El-Khoury. We will end this panel with you with 5 minutes. You can please
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Minister. Thank you for your generosity, always being available to us. Minister, is it possible, may I ask you, whether you could take a few moments to finish your response to Ms. Kwan concerning biometrics?
In the two-step process that you have mentioned before. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you. When I was first appointed to this position in Afghanistan, quickly became the the initiative on which I spent the vast majority of my time. One of the biggest bottlenecks to having people move was the lack of ability to conduct biometric assessments to understand and assure that the people who are coming to Canada pass the ordinary security screening process. The lack of a presence on the ground made that exceptionally difficult. We came up with an alternative plan that gathers whatever information we can find about a person, we call it an enhanced biographic screening, to allow them to move to the next step in the process. That will get us to a position where we can allow a person to move outside of Afghanistan should they have the ability to do so, and we can complete the biometric screening process there so we don't compromise on the security screening, but also don't delay the ability of a person to come through the process and to exit Afghanistan, which they are so desperate to do under extraordinary circumstances.
Merci, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you, Minister. We know that the third country process is very difficult for Western allies who are trying to work together to counter the Taliban, helping refugees still trying to get out. In the report, it is said the operational context remains complex and dangerous. Is it possible, Minister, to tell us more about how difficult the situation is?
And just to put it into perspective, I deal with not only the partners who we seek to have assist our resettlement effort, but also with partners who are conducting similar efforts so we can share best practices and understand common challenges. The challenges around safe passage for the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, and others who are participating in it reflect precisely the same challenges Canada is experiencing. The difficulties we're encountering around safe passage, around the lack of access to travel documents for people seeking to flee, around the challenges of people who've made their way into third countries, whether through ordinary or irregular ways, are common for all countries that have a resettlement effort. We're working together as an international community to share these understandings so we can improve the quality of our resettlement process, but it's not easy. We're dealing with a territory where the Taliban is in control, a terrorist organization in our laws in Canada. There are no easy strategies here, but we're going to continue to cooperate with partners to overcome these barriers. And I want to save time because I don't know if the committee would allow it, but our colleague, Ms. May, has shown up. And if time allows, after Mr. El Khoury finishes, I would be happy to extend my stay by a moment or two, should committee members allow it.
Minister, concerning Recommendation 22, to hire more staff, it is said that IRCC was going to hire 1,250 new staff before the end of the fall 2022, and we're already in the following year, 23. Have you reached this objective? And if not, have you changed your goals for this? And are you reaching your goal? And if not, what are the problems?
We have now hired more than 1,250 staff and are continuing to add additional staff and have seen the expected increase in productivity with a reduction in wait times across various immigration streams. This was a big part of the strategy to overcome some of the challenges that the pandemic and our humanitarian responses put across our system. I think we have planning to do in the years ahead to develop that surge capacity that M. Brunel-Duceppe raised in one of his questions. But to answer your question directly, yes, we've completed that hiring initiative and continue to add more staff now.
Do you see some positive results that improved in the service that provides embassy around the world by hiring those people, and to what degree, according to you?
It depends on which immigration stream you're talking about, but the progress that we've seen has allowed us to return to ordinary service standards across most immigration streams, whether it's family reunification, express entry, work permits are shortly going to be back on the service standard we enjoyed before the pandemic. Study permits are more or less there now. We have a little bit of work left to do on visitor visas, but now the bottleneck to having people arrive in a timely way is really impacting the programs where the bottleneck is the number of spaces annually available given the extraordinary demand in certain programs rather than the processing capacity of IRCC, with the exception of visitors visas, which we expect this year will be back on track.
Time is up for Mr. Al-Khoury. Minister mentioned about Ms. May. For that, I've checked with the clerk. Either one of the members have to give their time, or we need a unanimous consent from the committee members to have her ask the question. So do I have the unanimous consent from the committee?
On this side, we are fine.
No.
No. We don't have the unanimous consent, so with that, this...
One of the members was willing to give his time, I believe.
But he took his old time, like Mr. Al-Khoury took his old time, like his 5 minutes are done. So I have to go the way the rules are of the committee. So with that, I would like to thank the Minister for his appearance before the committee. On behalf of all the members, I would really like to thank you, Minister. And we will suspend the meeting for 2-3 minutes so that Minister can leave, and then we will go into round of questioning with the officials. Thank you.
But that's what I understood, but you are not.
To order, if all the members can take their seats. We have the officials with us for the second round, and we will directly go into round of questioning, and we will begin with Mr. Reddycop. Mr. Reddycop, you will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please. Ms. Rempel-Garner, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you. I'll ask my colleague to time me. Ms. Fox, on Thursday of last week, Senator McFedrin gave a speech in the Senate which outlined some pretty serious allegations. In it, she said...
Hello.
If I can have like a bit of silence in the room. Ms. Rempel-Garner.
In it, she alleges that there was, and I'll read it to you, key within the kinds of communications that were happening day and night was a small circle of high officials which I had been invited to by Minister Monsef. I had asked to bring in a consultant, which was then named as somebody, I believe, named Laura Robinson in the subsequent Toronto Star article, who had been working with me for a number of years because she was a member of a national team here in Canada. I had been asked to help hundreds, many more athletes that I was already trying to help parliamentarians and human rights defenders. The email circle I have, every email, they're dated and stamped. The authorities are named within them. I can tell you tonight that the template we used, we being that group, to try and help, and we have succeeded, and I mean we, this network from Denmark to Zurich, we used what's called a visa facilitation letter. With regard to this, do you have any evidence or have you investigated whether former Minister Maryam Monsef was involved in producing the facilitation letters that Senator McPhedran described?
Thank you. I think what I would say is that first I would start by saying sort of how, because of Government of Canada efforts and because of the time on the ground to get people to airports, the facilitation letters issued by IRCC and GAC to our clients helped get people out, 3,700 people out. And that's an important fact to raise at the committee. And we needed to use those letters.
If you have any evidence whether former Cabinet Minister Maryam Monsef was assisting in issuing facilitation letters.
So what I can tell the committee is I looked at the organization, IRCC, in terms of the review of whether or not any inauthentic letters came from our department. And I can say that as a result of that investigation, we have found that there's no evidence that any inauthentic letters came from the department. And the next step was to refer the matter to law enforcement agencies, and they take it from there.
So you haven't reviewed whether or not some of the claims that are in here that the former Minister of Defense, his Chief of Staff, was helping to produce these inauthentic facilitation letters. Is that correct?
That's correct. We've only reviewed IRCC internal. Our investigation was limited to our department.
Are you aware of any investigation into whether or not the allegations that Senator McPhedran made are true as it pertains to former Chief of Staff George Young and former Cabinet Minister McPhedran? Actually, I'll ask a different question. Do you have any documentation or awareness that Senator McPhedran, former Cabinet Minister Monsef, or George Young had contacted IRCC to perhaps expedite certain cases? Like, did Senator McPhedran ever reach out? Do you have documentation of Senator McPhedran reaching out to IRCC saying, please help this list of people? Did she attempt to do that?
I do not have any evidence that she sent any documentation to IRCC staff.
Okay, so you have no record of Senator McPhedran or within your department during this time period asking IRCC for facilitation letters or assistance with certain cases?
Maybe, Madam Chair, what I would just add to what the deputy has said is that many members of Parliament including senators, were reaching out to IRCC to see how they could help. What can we do? And as one of the honourable members has mentioned today, lots of folks had lists, but certainly in terms of did IRCC cooperate to help with facilitation letters, the answer is no. But we did talk to lots of members of Parliament during the crisis.
Why was this referred to the RCMP before there were questions? In your internal review, did you ask Senator McPhedran what happened personally? Did you have conversations with her?
I did not.
Did anyone in your department?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. Why was this referred to the why was this decision made to refer this to the RCMP before, or as opposed to discussing with Senator McPhedran or anyone that she may have alleged was involved?
I think that when a matter of the use of inauthentic letters surfaces in a department, it is important to take the next steps. And in our view, the next steps were to refer the matter to law enforcement in light of the fact that the use of inauthentic letters can lead to very difficult outcomes for the government.
Finally, my office was in contact with IRCC for over the course of a year with these letters. And I'm just going to be really blunt. They fooled me. I've sat on this committee for years. I never once thought that they could be inauthentic. At any point in time when my office was corresponding with you on my file, when you reviewed this particular case, did anyone flag that these could potentially be false?
So maybe what I could add, Madam Chair, is that inauthentic letters started to pop up in the system.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for
Okay.
Mr. Empel-Gardner. You will get an opportunity in the second round. We will now proceed to Mr. El-Khoury. Mr. El-Khoury, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses, the officials, for being here to answer our questions. My first question is for Ms. McIntyre. Ms. McIntyre, your answer regarding recommendation 3, that of creating a emergency mechanism for surges ready to deploy in future humanitarian crises. Could you tell us more about what IRCC findings were about emergency measures and crisis management that lead to a possible way of developing a surge force? And could you give us some of the ways you will evaluate how you go forward with this? Ms. Chair, maybe I will jump in and take the question, given that the organization of the department is managed by the Deputy Minister. So first, thank you for your recommendation. I, too, have underscored that there are many crises that we're handling at IRCC: Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, Haiti. We have closely examined recommendations to see whether we are correctly organized and equipped to respond to crises. So looking at the committee's recommendation, we said, yes, indeed, there are probably things that we could do within the department and also lessons we can learn from other partners, national defense, foreign affairs, and so on and so forth. Yes, we are looking closely at our structure. We're weighing what is needed to have a well-staffed and team that knows what it's doing. We know that any crisis requires specific interventions, but there are some things that are common to all crises. So what can we do as a department to be ready for any crisis? So yes, we are reviewing this, we are studying this, and we're thinking about this within the department in order to ensure that we're better placed to respond and that we learn from what we've been through. This has been a very difficult and chaotic period, almost very difficult to compare the response to Afghanistan to responses to other circumstances. Taliban taking control of Kabul was such that people found it very difficult to move around, and that remains the case. That is why working closely with regional partners to secure safe passage remains of the highest importance to us. So yes, we are looking at how we're organized, how we can respond to crises, and yet remain up and operating, handling normal processing in a normal way. So thank you. This is a very important issue. Thank you, because you have said that you appreciate our work. And I can tell you that what you have as a recommendation is the result of several months of work here in the committee. So thank you for appreciating what we've offered you. Could you tell us more about the difficulties that people face getting into surrounding countries and then getting out of those surrounding countries to Canada? Are you using Qatar, the Emirates, for example? And what more can be done to make it easier to get people out? Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. Yes, we are working closely with our partners, not solely regional partners, but also the United States and other departments here within the federal government. It's important to realize that to get out of Afghanistan, people need a passport. To get out of the surrounding countries, there are special exit permits that are often needed for them to be able to get on a flight to Canada or to any other country. So this makes it of the highest importance to maintain our partnerships, to remain on good footing with those working with us to secure safe passage for these people. Since your report, June 2022, 43 flights, 13,000 people have come out through Pakistan, Tajikistan. So we have been making serious efforts since the report was tabled. Now our difficulty is getting the clients out of Afghanistan itself. And of course, we need to work with our partners in the region. This is not easy to do. Thank you. Your work is appreciated throughout the world by the international community and by us here in the government. Another question. Your response to recommendation number 15 to the effect that one of the only ways to get Afghan out safely through a third country is by having good, cordial, ongoing diplomatic relations with these third countries to ensure that safe passage is provided. You explained this situation, but could you tell us more so that we'll know whether this is working or not and how well? And if it's not working, what more can you do? Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. The surrounding countries are such an important part of our plan to get Afghans out safely. We mustn't forget our very important relationships with international organizations as well, the UN, the International Organization for Migration.
We will come back in the second round if you want. We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desepp for 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much. And thank you to you as well for still being with us. Yes? Okay, nothing. Sorry. By the way, I'm very proud of the emergency structure that I've been working on for a good while now, that was worked into the recommendation and that you now seem to have accepted and seem to be working with. So if we need such a plan, it's because that plan wasn't there before, that it should have been there, that it was missing, and that not having it has had effect on managing the Afghan crisis. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to create such a plan. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, what I will say is that there has been an extraordinary level of teamwork covering a number of departments to organize, to respond to this crisis that has led to concrete results, an ability to go in and get the most vulnerable people out of Afghanistan. I think that it is responsible in any crisis situation when you undertake a new program, a new project, a new response to a crisis, to carry out an evaluation with an open approach, being able to look at what is working, what has worked in the past, what can be improved as you move along. So I'm certainly not ready to say that the efforts were inadequate. It is true that improvement must be ongoing because international trends are changing so quickly. The international response is continuously evolving. So as the Deputy Minister of the Department, it's my role to look at what we can learn and to apply things better going forward. All right, but you would agree with me that had the plan that we're now creating been there before, we would have managed the crisis differently. It's quite normal. I'm not blaming you. It's just that that's the way it works. What I'm saying is that the teams got together to work up a crisis plan to manage the crisis that led to very real results on the ground. And that's what we're continue to work to improve. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I wasn't able to make you say what I had in mind, but I tried. Do you have discussions with other departments? Do you have interdepartmental conversations, or do you work alone? Oh, no. We work very closely with our colleagues in other departments. Okay, so you talk with deputy ministers or people who are your vis-a-vis, for example, about issues like Afghanistan. Good, fine. Now, did you get any discussions about recommendations 9, 10, and 11 with these people to the effect that the criminal code in Canada must be changed, that this is an urgent matter? You'll remember that that report goes back to the month of June. So it should be done as quickly as possible. Is this something that's just not very clear to other departments, or is it something that I and my electors say that it's an urgent matter? Yes, we have, of course, discussed all the recommendations with our colleagues, not solely for developing a response to the report, but also to coordinate who would undertake the various follow-up measures. 9, 10, and 11, yes, we talked about 9, 10, and 11 in the criminal code. Yes, we've discussed the legislative options that might make it possible for us to work with the NGOs on the ground. So what do you mean by doing it quickly? Well, it can mean different things depending on the circumstance, but in this case, quickly, without delay, means that once we will have studied all aspects of a file and understand the various consequences of taking action and understand all the considerations that must be weighed in on, and then you undertake the change. What do you think of the next sentence? The Government of Canada work without further delay in order to apply Resolution 2915 adopted by the United Nations. What's your view on that? I see this in the context of our work across departments. We have a parliamentary system, so there are natural delays within a parliamentary system. So as quickly as possible means what we can do as quickly as possible. So according to you, that's a year later, 6 months after the report was tabled. 2615 was voted on in December 2021. The end of December, the date of the marriage of my parents, I remember it. So now it's a year and a half later, pretty much. And is this reasonable for a G7 country to be unable to apply a resolution such as the 2615 already voted on at the UN? What I can say, Chair, is that we are working closely with all departments on the changes needed to make it possible for us to work appropriately in the field, on the ground, to help the most vulnerable Afghans. Do you realize that that answer, which is the same answer I've heard for a year now, is not sufficient for the ONGs who are out there in the field, out there on the ground, who are trying to help the women, the girls, the people in such difficulty in Afghanistan? We've been hearing the same thing for a year, and there's other legislation in other countries around the world, and they've managed to bring in these changes quickly. They've got parliamentary systems as well. So why is it that in your discussions with the other deputy ministers, is at least anyone saying, look, we've got to do this fast? Is anyone getting upset about it amongst you during these discussions, or are you just saying, oh, no, everything's fine, this is just normal? What I would say is that everyone is working hard on it, that we are working with key partners. The conversations you're having are conversations we have with our partners as well, and they understand our need to solve this problem. So where's the bottleneck?
We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan for 6 minutes. Ms. Kwan, you can please begin.
Thank you very much. I think to begin, if I could ask officials to provide a briefing document to the committee on these facilitation letters. For example, to just give basic information, what are these facilitation letters? Where did they come from? Who issued them, i.e. which ministry is authorized to issue them? Who is authorized to distribute them? Who received them? On what evaluation or eligibility consideration were given to the people who were in receipt of them? If the media's report is correct, how is it that For example, a senator would have gotten hold of a facilitation letter for distribution, or a political aide or former political aide got a letter for distribution. You may or may not have these answers, but I'm asking these questions just so that we know what is the lay of the land. You mentioned earlier that you know how many facilitation letters were issued from your department, and yet there are so many other ones that are out there. Could we get those numbers as well? And just so that we can have a sense of what is going on with respect to that. These are just some of the questions that I am asking for, but any other relevant information relating to this situation and about the use of these facilitation letters, if you could provide that information to the committee, it would be much appreciated.
Okay, maybe I can start, and if I will definitely, so the facilitation letters.
Sorry, if I could get that in writing to the committee, because I have, 6 minutes, and I have many other questions I need to sort of get into, and this is just background information, really, that should be provided. And if we can get this information, it sounds like you already have the information at hand, to the committee within, by the end of next week, if that's reasonable, so that we can get that information.
So we will definitely give you the information. I will take a check to see exactly kind of for translation and other measures to make sure, but I think next week sounds reasonable, but I will confirm with the committee clerk.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Just as a reminder to all the members, all the questions should be addressed through the chair. Thank you.
I would like to actually go on to the next question. And now, on the issue around Afghans who's been stranded, we know that some of them are in Pakistan. Some of them have visas that have expired, and that was to be expired. And then by the end of December of last year, the Pakistani government is actively pursuing the people with expired visas. So since that time, how many Afghans have we brought to Canada to safety, and are there any of them that had expired visas from Pakistan? And as well, how many flights are being put in place to continue to bring Afghans to safety? If you can give us a general average of how many flights can we anticipate that are coming out, that would be appreciated as well. And I guess how many flights for how many seats, that would be useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think I would say that arrivals to date from Pakistan are 9,806. As I noted, there were charter flights that were organized, about 43 since June 2022, but they're not limited to charter flights. We also have commercial flights in terms of, and that's not just from Pakistan, but Tajikistan and other neighboring countries. In terms of going forward, how many flights are being organized, I think it would be very challenging to have specific data as these details are still being worked out.
Could we get the breakdown of those numbers in writing to the committee on how many of those actually came after December 31st, 2022? And if you have the breakdown of those, how many of them are from Pakistan? And I'm particularly interested in if any of the people who made it out of Pakistan, for example, with expired visas, is the department entertaining and bringing people to safety with expired visas or even invalid visas for whatever reason?
Madam Chair, I just might jump in to add a couple of things regarding the question of visas in Pakistan. The government of Pakistan, like every country, does have exit requirements which do have to be met by all foreign nationals who are departing, and a valid visa is very important. We're working very closely with the government of Pakistan through our High Commission to have streamlined processes for IRCC clients who do have expired visas so that we can facilitate them having a renewed visa, which will facilitate their departure from Pakistan.
With people who have an expired visa at the moment, if they're caught, this is what the individuals on the ground are telling me. They would have to come up with money to renew their visa, on average $700 US per person. that is only for a short-term visa, not for a full year. And if they had to look for a full-year visa, they're looking at over 1,000, like 1,200, 1,500. And sometimes they're faced with a situation where they have to pay money that's not authorized towards the visa. And so there's a lot of challenges to which people are faced with. And they, of course, don't have money. These are people who are in hiding, have not been working. And coming up with that kind of financial capacity is almost impossible. So consequently, people are in a real dire situation. So I guess, so in the discussion with the Pakistani government and authorities, where there's some special dispensation being allowed for those who Canada would bring to safety, how do you ensure that those without visas are not going to be caught out and that they would be included? Do you have a list of who those people are and you provide it to the authorities in Pakistan to ensure that they are not going to be faced with challenges?
Sorry, the time is up for Ms. Kwan. Maybe you will get an opportunity when we come back in the second round.
Maybe I can get that in writing then.
We will now proceed to Mr. Redekop. Mr. Redekop, you will have 5 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to return to Ms. McIntyre. You were answering a question from my colleague Michelle Rempel-Garner, and it was, did anyone flag that these visa letters could be fake? And you had just started answering, and then the time ran out.
Madam Chair, maybe just to back up a little bit, I would say that IRCC and Global Affairs, as we all know, were issuing facilitation letters, but these letters did not confer status on any person who received them. A full eligibility and admissibility assessment was done on all individuals before they would come to Canada. It's just a protocol of IRCC when an inauthentic document of any sort pops up in the system. There are multiple protocols in place to be sure that there is that such documents are not being used in a way that they're not supposed to be. So, for example, these letters were not meant to facilitate boarding on a flight to Canada. They were not meant to be a visa to Canada. And so when you see any document that's being attempted to be used for a reason that it's not intended, there is a flag in the system. And that's just a protocol.
The recommendation 26 of the report speaks to the role of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and specifically asked that IRCC waive the requirement for Afghanistan. We heard testimony during our backlog study about UNHCR and its ineffectiveness in dealing with certain religious or sexual orientation minority groups in countries such as Pakistan. So in the government response, there's an acknowledgement of the ineffectiveness of the UNHCR program when it comes to Afghanistan. Has IRCC engaged in talks with representatives of the UNHCR, either here or in Canada, about efforts to reform this organization, Ms. Fox?
Thank you very much. And I think it's important that, to the question around sort of how do you effectively respond, and I think that we have been through the humanitarian stream of our programming, been able to work with a number of organizations that have secured the safe passage of LGBTQ2+, journalists, politicians, etc. We are in very close contact with the UNHCR for a lot of our work, and so we continuously try to improve the work that we do together in a partnership. And so the answer to your question is yes, we are in touch with them, and yes, we are always looking at ways to be more nimble and to be more responsive to a particular crisis.
I want to talk a little bit about some local groups. I had mentioned to the minister the group called Nest in Saskatoon. They're working to bring Afghans to Canada. They submitted applications. They were told that the slots had been filled. They submitted applications the very next day in October 17th of 2022. So was there a quota for approved applications for each province and territory?
It was not a quota by province or territory. We definitely have data in terms of the settlement efforts by province or territory. And I think what I would also note is, as we have done, we continuously look at ways, innovative ways to respond and pivot. And that's something that the department has done continuously. And one way that we have done that is through the Group of Five sponsorship, where 3,000 places were allocated to people that we waive the requirement for a refugee a UNHCR refugee determination. And so that allowed a little bit more flexibilities for groups who wanted to take part in welcoming Afghans.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'll cede my time to Ms. Garner.
Thank you. Madam Chair, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, I move that A, the committee extend the total number of meetings currently allocated to the current study regarding the government's response to the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan by a minimum of 3 meetings to be held prior to March 31st, 2023, and B, Senator Mary Lou McFedrin, MP Mark Garneau, Minister Harjit Sajjan, and Minister Marco Mendicino be invited to appear separately before the committee prior to March 31st, 2023 for 2 hours each to discuss matters related to the current study, and C, Dr. Lauren Oates, Dr. Lauren Oates of the Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan group be invited to appear individually before committee prior to March 31st, 2023 for 1 hour to discuss matters related to the current study, and D, summonses do issue for the appearances of former Minister of Women and Gender Equality Mariam Monsef, consultant Laura Robinson, and George Young to appear separately for 2 hours each at dates and times to be fixed by the chair, but no later than March 31st, 2023 to discuss matters related to the current study, and E, summonses do issue for the appearances of senior departmental officials from the officials from the Department of National Defense to appear before committee at a date and time to be fixed by the chair, but no later than March 31st, 2023 to discuss matters related to the current study. I have sent this motion to the clerk in both official languages, and this motion is in scope as it relates to the current matter that the committee is studying. I will begin my rationale for this motion by stating that I am certain Senator McFedrin acted from a place of good intent in issuing these facilitation letters. I ask my colleagues to listen to my rationale carefully because I'm not moving this out of political motivation, but out of a very human face that I have been acquainted with for over a year now. I believe that we should have rescued more Afghans than the government did. And I want to explain to this committee why I believe this motion passes by sharing the story of my constituents. The letters that were issued by Senator McFedrin put the family of one of my constituents in danger and later stymied their efforts to come to Canada. I think it's important to put their case on the record. I will not be disclosing their identity due to safety and privacy concerns, and I'm sharing information that I have previously received permission to disclose from them. On August 23, 2021, a constituent contacted my office on behalf of her cousin and his family of 9 who are Afghan nationals. She relayed to my office that her cousin was a member of an NGO that was supported by the Canadian government and that he was able to provide IRCC with contribution agreements between the NGO and the Canadian government that had substantiated a working relationship. She explained to my office that her cousin and his family had been trying to flee Afghanistan to Canada because their lives were at risk due to their work on democracy, equality, and freedom of speech in partnership with the Government of Canada. They were being threatened by the Taliban. My constituent had contacted my office because of confusion as to why her family wasn't being assisted in resettling to Canada and issues with communication with IRCC and GAC officials. She requested that we inquire about these issues and assist in providing closure to her case. Upon this request for assistance from my office, we asked for my constituent's cousin, who I will refer to as Mr. X, consent to inquire about his status, and we were provided with consent forms, third-party authorization, and documentation of the applicant's connection to the Canadian government. When my constituent began communicating with my office, she sent us an email that Mr. X said he had received from the IRCC department in Islamabad on July 27, 2021, suggesting that he apply for a quote, temporary public policy to resettle Afghans to Canada. He provided my office with the emails he said that he had sent to IRCC to apply for this measure within the same time constraints outlined therein. This application was submitted to IRCC, the IRCC department in Islamabad by Mr. X on July 29, 2021. As per instructions, he said he received in the above referenced email from department officials. My constituent was also able to provide evidence that he had, in fact, provided services to Canada by being in possession of a Government of Canada service contract with an NGO he was affiliated with, and documentation apparently issued from that NGO of his relationship on the work that was the subject of that contract. They were also able to provide evidence of Government of Canada officials working with them. In August of 2021, Mr. X's family was also directly corresponding with Senator Mary Lou McPhedran on Mr. X's and his family's potential passage from Afghanistan to Canada. My constituent made my office aware of this correspondence with the senator after the federal election on October 15, 2021. She told my office that Senator McPhedran and her office had directly provided Mr. X with, quote, letters of facilitations, which stated that a visa had been granted to certain members of Mr. X's family and could facilitate their passage to Canada. Until this point, my office was acting on the assumption that Mr. X's family had received some kind of official documentation directly from the Canadian government, from Canadian government officials in IRCC or GAC. These documents, which include the Government of Canada logo and a seal bearing the appearance of a Government of Canada department, appear to be sent to Mr. X and his family via email by the Senator and her office on August 26, 2021. The email also suggests that the family present themselves at the Hamid Karzai International Airport, specifically the Barron Gate, and to not discuss with anyone that they had received this correspondence. My constituent told my office that upon receiving these documents and based on advice contained in the above-referenced email from Senator McPhedran and her office, Mr. X's family attempted to reach the Hamid Karzai Airport on August 26, 2021, but were faced with extremely unsafe conditions and were forced to turn back. She also expressed to my office that having been in receipt of these documents and having applied for the, quote, temporary public policy to resettle Afghans that was outlined in the email from IRCC Islamabad, my constituent told my office that her and her family believed they were able to gain passage to Canada, but were unclear as to why they were unable to get assistance to leave. Between August 2021 and June 2022, my office has corresponded with GAC and IRCC over 30 times throughout email and telephone calls to determine the status of Mr. X's and his family's resettlement status. Throughout, we continue to update IRCC and GAC on Mr. X's family situation in Afghanistan, which they expressed had significantly deteriorated and had included Taliban interviews and harassment. My correspondence with my constituent began during the middle of a federal election when the government was in caretaker mode, while there was little clarity on what processes or documentation the government was using to evacuate persons. Given these roadblocks, upon receipt of this correspondence, my office began trying to understand why Mr. X's family resettlement process was delayed given the efforts that they had already undertaken and documentation in their possession. After multiple inquiries, IRCC was not able to confirm to my office their receipt of the application submitted by Mr. X on July 29, 2021 for the, quote, temporary public policy to resettle Afghans, even when presented with documentation my constituent forwarded to my office, corroborating her family's claim that an application was submitted within the time constraints allowed. IRCC would not confirm that such a referral was made to Mr. X in late July 2021, even after IRCC was provided with documentation which seems to corroborate the same. While the documentation provided to my office corroborated that Mr. X's family actually applied in July 2021 for this temporary public policy seemed legitimate, IRCC never acknowledged they were in receipt of this application or that they took any action on it. Subsequent to Mr. X's application to the measure outlined in that email, the government announced an additional immigration program to resettle Afghans. To me, there seemed to have been a lack of coordination between the temporary public policy contained in the email that Mr. X initially responded from IRCC Islamabad and this new program, which in turn seemed to have led to much confusion to Mr. X's family. That is, they thought that they were already engaged in one valid application stream for assistance in evacuating to Canada, and they made assumptions that their application was still in process. My office certainly didn't hear otherwise for some time. The lack of resources for Afghan evacuation and direction in IRCC at the time of the initial application to the temporary public policy measure, coupled with the fact that the government was in caretaker mode during a federal election, is a matter of public record. So after some time trying to ascertain the status of Mr. X's original application, an IRCC official gave advice on January 18, 2022, months later, for their family to apply again. this time to the, quote, Special Immigration Measures Program for Afghans with a service provision relationship with Canada. They did so on February 5th, 2022. Several months later, on May 27, 2022, they received a decision on this application. They were informed by IRCC that while Mr. X and his family may have been eligible for the special program, IRCC was not moving forward with their application, citing program space constraints. I have to wonder if they had known that these documents were inauthentic, if they could have actually made it into the country under this program. Additionally, during these interactions with GAC and IRCC, my office was never able to substantiate the official status of the so-called letters of facilitation and instructions Mr. X's family had received on August 26, 2021, from Senator McPhedran and her office. My office had begun this process by trying to understand why some of Mr. X's family had been granted documentation but not others. Again, when my constituent began corresponding with my office, they were operating under the assumption that they were in the possession of some sort of official documentation issued in the haste and chaos of the Government of Canada's efforts to evacuate certain persons during the fall of the country. Many of the traditional abilities that my office would normally use to verify information in casework weren't readily available in this instance, given the opacity of government processes for evacuating Afghanistan, the fact that Canada was in the middle of a federal election with the government in caretaker mode. My office only became aware in October 2021, after the federal election had concluded, that Mr. X's family obtained this documentation directly from the senator and her office, as opposed to direct correspondence with GAC or IRCC officials. This caused a significant amount of confusion for my office, as after initial discussions with my constituent, our correspondence with GAC and IRCC was to try to understand only why a few of Mr. X's family had been issued documentation to travel as opposed to all of them. Since discovering that Mr. X's family received these letters from the senator and her office, we went back and forth with GAC and IRCC trying to ascertain their official status. So after speaking to multiple officials in both IRCC and GAC for months, no official confirmed to my office that the documents and instructions sent to Mr. X by Senator McPhedran and her office were actually issued by any official in any department of the Government of Canada. After Mr. X's reapplication to the Special Settlement Program was formally declined, citing space constraints in May 2022, I spoke directly with Senator McPhedran in early June 2022. This is the first and only time I have communicated with the senator regarding this matter. During this call, she verbally confirmed she had indeed corresponded with Mr. X. I did not ask her where she had obtained the documents that her and her office sent to Mr. X during this call, because my office had not received a definitive answer from IRCC or GAC on the status of the documents. Typically, we get clear answers on these situations. We assumed the delay in getting confirmation was because it had been unclear to my office what processes and documentation the Canadian government was consistently using, if any, to facilitate departures during the chaos of the evacuation which occurred in August 2021. I had reached out to see if there was something I had missed in the file and to reaffirm the validity of my constituent's claim. Never once had I thought that a sitting parliamentarian would have issued inauthentic documentation. I had no reason for concern until subsequent to my call with Senator McPhedran. I was made aware of an article published in the Edmonton Journal asserting that an unnamed Canadian senator had been directly issuing documentation to Afghan nationals from their office, and that formal diligence may have not been undertaken to ascertain the veracity of claims of some persons for which these letters had been issued. As such, my office redoubled efforts to press IRCC and GAC to determine the actual origins of documents sent to my constituent's family, as they expressed they had material influence on Mr. X's family's efforts to leave Afghanistan. When I received no response and having no further recourse, I wrote a letter outlining the situation to Minister Fraser. I received a response from Minister Fraser to my letter of July 7th on July 27th, which outlined that he had undertaken an investigation and that the documents were deemed to be inauthentic, and he had referred the matter to authorities. Subsequent to this response, in September 2022, the Globe and Mail published an article entitled "Canadian Senator Sent Documents to Afghan Family That Weren't Authentic," which outlined allegations that Senator Mary Lou McPhedran issued inauthentic travel documents to Afghan nationals. And then, last week, on Thursday, February the 2nd, 2023, Senator McPhedran rose in the Senate and delivered a speech alleging that while she did in fact issue what she referred to as visa facilitation letters to certain Afghan nationals, she alleged she did so in coordination with the former Minister for Women and Gender Equality, Maryam Monsef, a consultant, and a, quote, small circle of high officials, including unnamed persons in other nations. In this speech, Senator McPhedran also alleged that hundreds of potentially inauthentic letters may have been issued, which allegedly had been provided via a template documentation which bore the appearance of official Canadian documentation by George Young, the former Chief of Staff to former Minister of Defence Harjit Sajjan. Senator McPhedran made these allegations under the cone of parliamentary privilege afforded to her in the Senate, and none of these allegations have yet to be proven. A subsequent article published in February the 3rd, 2023 by the Toronto Star entitled "A Canadian Senator Helped Save Afghan Women." The Immigration Department called the police on her. Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada stated, in order to facilitate the evacuation of vulnerable Afghans, the Government of Canada sent letters directly to Afghan nationals who were eligible to come to Canada in order to help them clear checkpoints on the way and at the airport in Kabul. IRCC did not authorize any third party to issue these facilitation letters on their behalf. So we have a problem, colleagues. The public assertion by IRCC that they did not authorize anyone, including persons named above, to issue travel documentation for Afghan nationals raises numerous questions that our committee should be considering. This situation is extremely concerning and involves very serious allegations. It raises questions about whether, among unknown others, a Canadian parliamentarian, a consultant she retained using tax dollars, a sitting cabinet minister, and the chief of staff to the Minister of Defence purposely issued inauthentic documents to Afghan nationals, which may have resulted in their Afghan evacuation or, in other cases, consequences resulting from being led to think that they were in a possession of official documents when, in fact, they were not, as was the case with my constituents. It raises questions about who within the government knew about this issue when, and what, if any, remedy has been taken. It also raises question about why a workaround, inauthentic process may have been used by senior persons in the government to evacuate Afghan nationals as opposed to official processes. It also raises questions why this process wasn't made public or wasn't made available to more parliamentarians. It also raises questions about the integrity of the government's selection process for Afghans with connections to Canada and the impact the issuance of inauthentic documents would have had on an untold number of Afghans who wish to come to Canada and should have come to Canada, but were not able to. It raises questions about queue jumping, identity verification, and most importantly, the equity of our immigration selection process. The 2021 fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban created a dire humanitarian crisis which precipitated an immediate response, even though the government had called a general election. I myself had the experience of watching my Afghan veteran husband see this news and knowing that we were in a position where we could respond. Every member of our committee has members of their community who are affected by this crisis. Many members work to address devastating cases of family members who were left behind and still live in hiding under constant threat from the Taliban while struggling with a government in an election necessitated caretaker mode. We all desperately want these persons to be afforded safe haven to Canada, but none of us issued fake visas. Parliamentary figures, be it members of parliament or senators, are not legally allowed to independently make these decisions. They are not part of the executive branch of government unless they hold an active appointment to the same. Similarly, ministers or their staff do not all hold the same powers and authorities. As such, these persons do not necessarily have the automatic power or authority by virtue of their own legislative office to do things like issue visas or bind the government to action on their own accord. This is true no matter how well-intentioned the person is, as I'm sure Senator McPhedran was, or how dire the circumstances are. Doing otherwise could have massive negative implications, including circumventing the necessary non-political arm's-length nature of things like Canada's immigration systems, which keep our processes safe for everyone, impartial, and fair. These things can and should only be done by appropriately empowered officials by the executive branch of the Canadian government via officially legislated and regulated processes. This doesn't mean the government shouldn't be held to account when the system fails. In fact, the role of parliamentarians in these situations is to inquire about processes and to hold the government to account to ensure processes are properly functioning, especially during times of crisis. This is what Senator McPhedran and allegedly former Cabinet Mariam Monsef should have used their powers to do. If these processes aren't working, it's Parliament's role to further hold the government to account for press for change. It's not our role to do things we are not duly authorized to do. It's not our role to use back channels through the government to do things like this. In fact, the government has a responsibility to prevent such back channels from existing. Which brings me to the substance of the motion, and I will close. Given the potential significant consequences and implications of the allegations outlined within Senator McPhedran's speech and in multiple media articles, I believe that it is of urgent importance to explore the extent and veracity of these claims and to ensure that appropriate remedy is, if necessary, is taken by the government. My constituent, I found out today, coincidentally, had a happy outcome. The American government helped him. Even though he had more of a connection to Canada, he is now in the United States. I wish I could have helped him. I wish I could have written a letter off the corner of my desk instead of spending a year spinning my wheels with government officials who weren't telling me what was going on while my constituent was under attack from the Taliban. That's what we're dealing with here. This isn't a joke. Why are summons necessary? There's summons in this motion. This government has taken the Parliament to court over a parliamentary order to issue documents. I have little faith that these types of officials will appear before this committee on a matter of this serious without summons. That is why I included the Department officials of Defense on a summons, because they canceled a meeting that was supposed to happen on this, in front of this committee on Monday after this story broke. Why all of these officials? These are the officials that Senator McPhedran has leveled allegations against in the Senate, and I would like to give them an opportunity to either clear their name or explain why they chose to engage in a workaround, inauthentic process instead of pressing for change as the position that they hold affords them. The bottom line is here, we can change the system. That is what each of us can do, and I know each of us tried to bring people into the country by trying to change the system. I know that even Liberal colleagues were likely pressing the government in the middle of an election to do better. I know that. I know this is not a partisan issue. And I know that everybody was well-intentioned here. But at the end of the day, the rules were broken and it hurt people. It hurt a lot of people. And it affected the integrity of our immigration process. I think we need to bring more people here. I think that the government shouldn't have gone to an election without a plan to deal with this. But we need to examine what happened here as Parliament. This is actually why this committee exists. We need to know how the system failed, why this was allowed to happen, what happened, so that we can recommend recourse to the government and so that the government can effect change. So for the sake of any outstanding casework that you have with Afghan nationals, for the sake of Afghan nationals that have not received a response from IRCC, we need to understand why the best bet for somebody to get into Canada was to have a parliamentarian, a senator, issue a fake visa to them off the corner of their desk. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lalonde.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Écoutez, avec tout le reste...
Thank you, Madam Chair. With all the respect that I have for my colleague opposite, I am profoundly disappointed. I am saddened. We worked very hard today to have the minister with us, as well as 4 officials, senior bureaucrats of the department, and I know that many of us had prepared our questions for them. That's what we had agreed to do. And once again, we have just derailed an important agenda, and yes, it is important to go on discussing this. That's exactly what we had in mind for today. That's it.
Merci.
Ms. Lalonde has requested to adjourn the debate, so it's a non-debatable motion. We will have to go into a vote. Mr. Clerk, if you can please take the vote.
Mr. Ali.
In favor?
Mr. Dhaliwal.
Support.
Mr. Essasi.
In favor?
Mr. El Khoury.
Pour.
For.
Madame Lalonde.
Pour.
Ms. Falk.
No.
Mr. McGuire.
No.
Mr. Redekop.
No.
Ms. Rampel Garner. No. Monsieur Brunel Duceppe.
Pour.
Ms. Kwan.
For.
Apologies for that. 7 yeas pour 7, nays contre 4.
The debate is adjourned. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you. I know we're out of time because I'm told that this room we lose it at 6:38. But that said, I note that myself and my colleague, MP Brunel Duceppe, lost our opportunity for a second round of questions to the officials. So I would like to be able to submit written questions to officials through you, Madam Chair, to the officials for those questions to be answered.
But would the officials be okay to? Okay.
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity on behalf of all the members to thank the officials for appearing before the committee. Thank you for all the work which you do on behalf of the Canadians. I know it's not an easy file. And with that, the meeting is adjourned.